Hey there kids, this is me, MrCreepyPasta, and before we get started on tonight's story, I just wanted to tell you about a really awesome book that features tonight's author as well, Calls from the Forest. I know that I've done a bit of a promo with another story for Calls from the Forest, but it is available now through the link in the description below. Check it out, everybody, and on to tonight's story. The sunlight was starting to sink, and it turned a deep gold by the time Samantha and Patrick reached the summit of Mount Wixatonic. Sam put her backpack on the large, smooth rock on the ground. She pulled out 2 water bottles and 2 granola bars, tossing one of each to Patrick. They sat together in silence, looking out at the vista that splayed out before them. From this vantage point, you could see all of Harper below them, and as far as Worcester. The two sat with their backs to the sun, watching seemingly microscopic life go about their daily routines beneath them. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, Patrick said. I don't want to spend the rest of my life as a tech in the emergency room. Samantha swallowed the last of her granola, taking a large swig of water before answering. Okay. Well, what did you have in mind? Nursing school, he said softly, not turning to meet her gaze. Nursing school, Samantha repeated thoughtfully. You've been thinking about this for a while? For about a year, he said quickly, quietly. I've been trying to think of a way to bring it up. Well? Samantha took in a deep breath and held it for a moment, returning her gaze to the world below. I think that's an absolutely amazing idea. She smirked when she saw his head suddenly whip around in surprise. Really? He almost shouted. Of course. Why didn't you bring this up sooner? She grabbed his hand, letting their fingers fold together. Patrick shrugged, feeling a little self-conscious. Well, first we bought the house, then there were all the repairs that had to be done, and I knew you needed a new car, and we just talked about trying to have a baby. Nursing school is expensive and time-consuming, so I guess I thought I was being selfish. Babe, listen. Yes, we want to have kids, but we're both only 23. We have plenty of time. As for money, we'll figure it out. Maybe I can take a loan out for my 401k to help. And you're not being selfish. Wanting to improve your career before we start a family is about as far away from selfish as you can get. She kissed his lips and touched her forehead to his, smiling. You're such a goober. They sat in content silence for a while longer. The sun had sunk low, casting the mountain's shadow for miles below them. To the southeast, tiny specks of neon light sparkled to life, some beginning to dance around each other like pastel fireflies. Oh, look, Patrick said, pointing to the lights. Carnival! I read that there was one coming around. I think it's in Swinton. Samantha smiled. You want to go? Most definitely, Patrick stood, offering her a hand up. Let's roll, Starsky. Samantha stretched as she stood, and took one more look around. Her smile faded a bit as she looked towards the west. What's up? He asked. I think we stayed here too long, babe. It's gonna get dark before we go to the bottom. She picked up her pack, slinging it around her shoulder, clipped it in the front. We'll be okay. We've hiked up here before. I got my map just in case. He smiled and winked at her. No problem. Yeah, that's true. She playfully slapped his butt. Let's do it, Hutch. Starting their descent, the couple laughed, joked, and reminisced about old commercials from the 80s as they tried to remember as many jingles and out-of-production products as they could. That then turned into a game in which each of them would sing the theme song of an old sitcom while the other tried to guess the show. Okay, try this one, Samantha said, after wrongfully guessing the theme song from Perfect Strangers. She took in a breath and started singing, but Patrick suddenly let out a yelp as he stumbled and fell, rolling several feet down the incline and landing up against a tree. Samantha froze in place for a heartbeat, shocked by the sudden outcry and motion. Coming quickly to her senses, she turned to Patrick, who wasn't moving. Baby, are you okay? She knelt next to him. Patrick? My leg. He took a sharp breath in. Okay, baby, lie still. She took out her phone and flicked on the flashlight, scanning the light over his leg. Both legs were covered in scratches and cuts, both fairly deep, and blood was running down to stain his socks a deep crimson. His left knee was deformed and swelling, and Samantha clenched her teeth and tried her best to ignore the churning in her stomach. She'd never understood how Patrick could be so calm around blood and injuries. She usually fainted at the sight of a simple cut, let alone the carnage that was on full display now. She fought waves of dizziness as she got the first aid kit out of his backpack. Your legs are pretty cut up, she said. And your knee is all messed up too, like, really bad. It's dislocated, Patrick said, wincing. I'm calling 911. Her voice was wavering, trying to remain composed. No, I can't. His words were cut short by the sharp glance that she gave him. Okay, he said. Okay. Samantha dialed the phone and hit the send button. A ball of ice formed in her stomach when the words, "No service," flashed across the screen. There's no signal, she said, then cleared her throat. I can't call out. I can hobble down, Patrick said. We'll find a big stick I can use as a crutch, and I'll just hobble down. I'll be fine. How? She countered. It's almost completely dark out. I don't really have much of a choice here, babe. It's too dangerous to go alone in the dark. What happens if you fall? We'll both be down in separate places, and it'll be pretty easy pickings for a hungry mountain lion wandering by. Samantha hung her head. Yeah, all right. Point taken. Let's at least try to clean up the cuts on your legs so that you're not dripping all over the mountain. Patrick wrinkled his nose. Patrick drippings. Gross, she said, pulling out the antiseptic wipes and gauze, unable to stop herself from smiling. See? Put his hand on her arm. It's not that bad. It's like Nana always said. If you can laugh, all is not lost. Samantha leaned forward and kissed him gently. Just get you patched up. She worked as quickly as she could, wiping dirt, leaves, pine needles out of his cuts and cleaning the wounds with wipes. She then wrapped his leg from the knee down with gauze while Patrick held the light for her. She found an ace bandage and wrapped his knee as tightly as she could. Well, I'm no nurse, but it'll do, she said, standing up. You did great, baby, he said. Now see if you can find a real big stick I can use to cosplay Gandalf while we climb down Mount Doom. You're such a nerd, she laughed and wrinkled her nose. Stay here, I'll be right back. Hilarious, Patrick said, mocking a deadpan expression. A few moments later, she returned to the sizable branch that forked at the end. With a considerable amount of effort, plus some grunting and more than one expletive, Patrick was back on his feet. The branch was a little long, but since they were on a fairly sharp incline, that worked to his advantage. He was able to stand on his own, but he would need Samantha's help to steady himself as they made their way down. We're gonna have to leave one pack behind, she said. I can't carry both and help you at the same time. Opening both packs, she started to consolidate as much as she could. She managed to squeeze the food and water into her pack, but had to take the fleece jacket, tie them around each other for her backpack straps. This will have to do, she said, standing up. Ready? No. Let's try it anyway, Patrick winked. What's the worst that could happen? Worst case? For you anyway. I get rich off this crazy huge life insurance policy I took out last week. She wiggled her eyebrows. My plan is all coming together. You ain't right, Patrick furrowed his brow. That's just wrong. All right, hop along, Cassidy. Let's boogie, she said, as she gently slapped his butt. It took nearly an hour to travel about a quarter mile, with Patrick having to plan each and every step in advance. He was poking his makeshift crutch into the sloping ground ahead of him, testing for holes, rocks, sticks, or slippery leaves. There were a few times that the stick caught just the edge of a large rock or a large patch of moss-covered logs, and Patrick thought that he was going to go down. He managed to adjust his balance and stay vertical, much to their surprise and relief. It was full dark with no moon when they reached the first signal post for Dunn's Falls to signal that they were about halfway down the mountain. Both breathed a sigh of relief. The steepest part of the mountain was behind them, and in about 1/3 of a mile the trail would be much wider and have far fewer obstacles in their path. These were the trails that were mostly used for recreational hikers, mountain bikers, even a few joggers looking up to their cardio game. Once they got onto them, it would be far smoother sailing. Patrick leaned against the wooden signpost, stretching his back as best he could. Leaning on the makeshift crutch was not doing any favors for his spine. Hey babe, I need to take a minute here, he said. Yeah, I could use a rest too, she agreed. You thirsty? Patrick slid himself down the side of the signpost, careful to keep his bad knee straight up on the way down. He took his phone out of his pocket, flicked on the flashlight, and shined it on his legs. He could see that his left knee was swollen, at least 3 times its normal size, even under all the bandaging. He imagined Dr. Sessler in the ER, his frizzy gray hair jutting out every which way as he stroked his beard and examined Patrick's knee. I suspect you've injured yourself, he would say. Dr. Obvious, that's what most of the staff called him when he wasn't around. He had a slightly annoying yet somehow charming idiosyncrasy of always overstating the obvious in any situation. Patrick was pulled out of his thoughts by Samantha handing him a bottle of water. She also handed him a couple of pills in the first aid pack. Aspirin, she said. Thank you, he said, taking the pills and holding one in his hand. He pulled her close and kissed her lips. I love you. I love you too, she smiled. They sat for a moment and looked at a small cluster of stars that shone through an opening in the canopy of leaves overhead. Patrick glanced down at his phone to check the time. We should get moving, he said. It's about 11:15. With a small sigh, she stood up and dusted her bottoms off, then extended a hand to help him get to his feet. Once he was up and had his crutch in position, he leaned against the sign for a moment, and she put the water bottles back into the pack. Just as she was zipping the side compartment, an unearthly sound echoed through the trees. Jesus, what the hell was that? Samantha jumped. Pretty sure that was a fisher cat, Patrick said. It's okay, babe. They rarely attack people unless provoked. That was not a fisher cat, Patrick, she said. I know what they sound like, and that was definitely not it. Well, there's only one other thing that I can think of that it could be then, he said. What? Her voice cracked. She hated herself for it. Sasquatch, Patrick said matter-of-factly, looking to make you his forest bride. Oh, you suck, she said wryly. I'm sure if it's not a fisher cat, then it's some other small critter that makes a lot of noise. Patrick started to take a step forward. A loud crack silenced Patrick for just a beat before he screamed, falling to the ground. His phone flew out of his hand and landed several yards downhill, casting long shadows along the trees. He writhed on the ground like a serpent, unable to speak, only uttering guttural growls of agony. Patrick? What happened? Samantha was at his side instantly. She frantically shone her flashlight on him, trying to figure out what was happening. The light caught a glint of metal, and as she looked towards his leg, ice flooded her spine. The culprit came into focus. Patrick's right ankle was caught in a bear trap. The rusted metal teeth pierced deep into his flesh. What? Patrick's eyes flushed as he fought waves of pain, feeling himself blacking out. Stay with me, baby. I need you to stay awake for me. Samantha tried to steady her voice. Your ankle is in a bear trap. I'm going to try to open it. I need you to pull your leg out when it's open, okay? Patrick nodded, still fighting the urge to pass out. Okay, she said. On the count of 3, yeah? 1, 2, 3. She pushed down with all of her might on the trap, trying to loosen the main spring, but it wouldn't budge. Patrick howled in pain and fell back, losing consciousness. Shit! Samantha took a deep breath and tried again. At least with Patrick unconscious, she didn't have to worry about causing him more pain. She again pushed down with all of her strength, but the jaws just wouldn't so much as move an inch. Patrick's eyes fluttered, but he didn't wake up. She sat back and put her face in her hands, blood rushing in her eyes. The only reasonable thing to do was to go for help, she thought. Even if I got his foot out of the trap, his left knee is busted up, and now so is his right ankle. There's no way he'll make it without being carried. With her mind made up, she untied both jackets from the backpack, rolled one up as a pillow and put it under Patrick's head. The other she draped over him as a makeshift blanket. She dug the water and granola bar out of the pack and placed them next to him within easy reaching distance. Then she went and retrieved his phone. She placed it next to the food. Thunder rolling in the distance. She looked skyward. She couldn't see any clouds from her vantage point, but the thunder was coming from the west. Damn it. That's all I need, she said. The thoughts of Patrick waking up alone and injured on the side of a mountain during a thunderstorm made her sick to her stomach, and she needed to move quickly. She wrote a quick note on the whitewater rafting brochure that Patrick had picked up at a rest stop along the interstate a few months ago, telling him that she had gone for help and not to move. She put the note on top of his phone and kissed his cheek. I'll be back as soon as I can, she said. I love you. Samantha made her way through the darkness as fast as she could. The widened trails and the more gradual incline made it easier to move at a quicker pace, not to mention being free of the burden of the backpack. She used her phone's flashlight to light the way, occasionally stopping to check to see if there was any signal, her heart sinking each time in disappointment. The thunder was getting closer and louder. There was something in the sound that made her uneasy, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Somehow the thunder sounded wrong. And on more than one occasion, she was sure that she heard the same unearthly sound they heard before Patrick stepped in the bear trap. It was closer than before. It sounded like an animalistic howl if it was filtered through the sound of an old dial-up modem. It seemed as though the sound, whatever was making it, was following her. At least she was within sight of the small, wooded parking lot. A single amber light buzzed lazily from its perch atop a small billboard, a map of the mountain on the sign. Moths and other assorted insects flew in tight circular patterns around the light, casting flitting shadows over the lot. Their car sat directly next to the lit billboard, just as Samantha grabbed her phone and began to ring, surprising her to the point where she almost dropped it. It was Patrick. He must have woken up and somehow had signal. She quickly answered, "Baby, are you—" She was cut off by a loud white noise and a hiss. Pulling the phone away from her ear, she looked down to find the phone was in video chat mode. On the screen, Patrick still lay unconscious on the ground. Oh dear God, she thought. There's someone up there with him. On the screen, the mysterious figure continued to move around Patrick, bringing the phone in close to his body and lingering on his leg. The video came to a rest on the bear trap stuck on his ankle. A crackle of static. Then the video shifted. The bear trap was now inexplicably off of his foot. Whoever was operating the camera was now holding the trap in front of the camera, and they were moving back up towards Patrick's head. Patrick's eyes flitted open and immediately looked towards the camera, eyes wide in terror. Before he could utter a word, the trap was thrust down violently onto his face, the metal jaws sinking deep into his skull on either side. He shuddered and twitched for a moment, letting out a muffled scream, and then silence. Samantha watched, horrified, frozen in place. The screen went back to static, followed by a blinding flash. Her hand was immediately racked in searing pain that quickly traveled up her arm, and in an instant later, she was unconscious. When she opened her eyes again, she found herself lying next to the signpost that she left Patrick next to. The jacket and backpack were still there, but he was gone. His phone lay on the ground, still in video mode. Blood covered the ground, the jacket, and the signpost. Spears of icy fear stabbed into her gut as she got to her feet. There were no drag marks, no other footprints, no animal tracks, nothing. It was as if he simply vanished. "Patrick!" she screamed into the darkness. "Where are you?" She fell to her knees, sobbing. Patrick was gone. Something was very, very wrong here. As she knelt to catch her breath, a scream ripped through the night air like a razor. "Patrick!" She held her breath and listened. Again, another scream that seemed impossibly far away. It was Patrick. She knew it was. He needed her. She steeled herself and stood up, limbs shaking wildly. She had to find him. She began to move, feeling like she was walking through water. Her feet were clumsily catching on rocks and twigs as she moved as quickly as she could in the direction that she heard Patrick. Lightning flashed, illuminating the tree around her in brilliant light. The thunder that immediately followed crackled and hissed. Much lower now, she could hear what had been eluding her before. There was a sound of static in the thunder, much like the snowy static on the television. The lightning flashed again, and the thunder followed almost immediately. She looked up in the sky, still completely clear, the stars shining brightly. The sound of the static and the thunder lingered in the atmosphere, echoing off the trees and rocks around her. A feeling of being watched crept its way down her spine. She turned off her flashlight, suddenly feeling vulnerable and exposed. The static was still hissing. Hissed in the air, and light form died as she shocked again. I'll go back here. A feeling of being watched crept its way down her spine. She turned off the flashlight, suddenly feeling vulnerable and exposed. The static was still hissing, and as the light from her phone died, she was shocked to find the trees in front of her were still illuminated with a flickering light. A fresh shot of icy fear shot straight into her heart, and she slowly turned around to look behind her. Sitting on a low tree branch, about eye level with her, was a small, flat-screen television. Snowy static filled the screen, casting dancing shadows around it. The thunderous static hissed from its speakers. Samantha blinked hard, trying to wrap her head around what she was seeing. Suddenly, the entire world felt wrong. The air smelled of electrical discharge, and the hair on her arms stood on end. The television's volume increased to almost deafening levels, and the snow began to fade, giving way to a picture. Patrick was sitting up against the trunk of a large tree, the bear trap still on his face. She could see his chest rising and falling sporadically, and wet, gurgling sounds emanating from beneath the trap. A figure appeared to the right of the screen. At first it looked like nothing more than snowy static, but quickly took on a humanoid shape. It moved like a man, but it was completely made of static. The static man moved quickly and silently in front of Patrick, obscuring her view of him, except for his legs. There was a fast flurry of unnatural motion, and Patrick's legs began to writhe in agony. The figure moved to the side, and she could see that the trap had been removed from Patrick's face. His eyes fluttered as the thing reached a luminous hand out and put its hand to his face. His eyes suddenly opened wide. Patrick let out an agonized scream. The creature joined in with its unearthly howl, both of which could be heard through the television and in the distance. Samantha stood with her hands clasped tightly over her mouth, tears leaving small, clean trails on her dirty face and hands. The lightning flashed and the television switched off, leaving her standing in the darkness. Her legs shook as her rapid breath came out in rasps. The pit of her stomach shifted and her jaws clenched. She fell to her knees and vomited so hard that she felt as though her back might break. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw another flicker. The static man was standing next to several large pine trees, silent and still. Though it had no face or distinguishing features, she could tell that it was staring at her. She pushed herself up on shaking arms, forcing herself to stand. The static remained motionless. Samantha began to back away from the thing, and after about 3 steps, it shot itself straight up into the air, creating a flash of lightning and a clap of thunder. Samantha stood and looked upward for any sign of the being, but found only stars. She stood frozen in a horrible state of decision. Should she return to Patrick to help him? Was there even anything she could do? Was he even alive? What was that thing? Would it come back? She knew her best hope, and Patrick's, was to find help as fast as possible. Her legs felt as though they were made of rubber as she began to move down the path again, her mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts and questions. All she knew for certain was that she needed to get help, and get back to him as fast as possible. It wasn't long before there was another flash of lightning and a crash of static thunder. Again, the static hiss remained. There was a bright flash, and a snowy static appeared in the trunk of a nearby pine tree in a vertical fashion, as if a television was turning on its side. The white screen once again gave way to a picture, and this time it was of a large dead oak tree in a small clearing surrounded by thick woods. She could see the static man hovering around a branch about halfway up. His arms were moving rapidly, but it was unclear what he was doing. Holding her breath, she stepped closer to the screen embedded in the tree. The static man suddenly moved backwards, and a dark object fell. Samantha squinted and moved closer, trying to figure out what she was looking at until it became terribly clear. It was Patrick, hanging from a noose. The bear trap still attached to his face. His body twitched a couple of times, and then he fell silent. Samantha hadn't realized how close to the screen she'd gotten until it filled again with snowy static, and a loud hissing split the silent night air. The screen rippled, forming waves that moved like liquid across the surface, and a hand made of snowy static reached through the screen to grab her wrist. The static hand burned her flesh as she struggled against it, and she could feel her flesh bubble and pop beneath. She tried to grab a hold of the fingers to pry them off, but her other hand was shocked with a spark of electricity that left her fingers numb and paralyzed. "Please, no!" she screamed. The hand pulled her closer to the screen. She could feel intense heat and electricity as her face came centimeters away from the screen. The tiny tendrils of static reached from the screen and latched onto her face and burned like tiny matches. 2 large tentacles shot out from either side and wrapped themselves around her body. Intense waves of pain racked her as the smell of burning clothing and hair lit her nostrils. In one swift motion, she was pulled in, with a sickening, sucking noise. And then the world went black. Samantha opened her eyes. Patrick's lifeless body hung 5 feet in front of her. His body was badly burned, and the bear trap had been reattached to his face. It was only a few seconds before she realized that she herself was in unbearable pain. Her hair had been burned off down to the scalp. Her clothes had been burned off. The nylon straps of her bra melted to her skin, but the cotton had burned away. Her arms had been stretched behind her and over a branch that hung at shoulder level. There was a noose made of vines hanging around her neck. She could feel liquid running down her legs, but she couldn't tell if it was blood, urine, or melted flesh. A flickering light illuminated the woods in front of her. The static man appeared and floated in between the trees, weaving in and out of them as if playing a game. It circled her several times, each pass coming a little closer until finally it stood at the bottom of the large oak tree. Slowly it ascended through the air until it was directly in front of her. She could feel it smiling, though it had no face. She could smell electricity over the scent of Patrick's and her own burnt flesh. "Please," she whispered. Luminous tentacles of snowy static shot from inside and then wrapped around the branch that she was standing on. Immediately catching the branch on fire, she lowered her eyes to see the thin branch engulfed in flames, and what was left of her lower lip trembled as her gaze shifted from the static man to Patrick. "I love you," she said, before the branch gave away underneath her. She fell quickly and barely felt the sharp snap in her neck. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the trunk of the dead oak tree, the one she was hanging from, the bark glowing, as static spread outward into the rest of the forest. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I just wanted to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video. Or listening to tonight's podcast on the podcast, if you're listening to that there at Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or wherever you could happen to listen to podcasts. I wanted to remind you guys also that my wife sells loose leaf tea at etsy.com/shop/ivorymonocle-tea. She has different teas, including Creepypasta teas, and you can get a Mr. Creepypasta tea. If you ask for a dabbing sticker, she also has those. And of course, I wanted to give a big thank you to everyone who checks out patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta and supports the show, keeps the light on, gives me treats for my now 2 cats, both Hylas and Hercules. Both of them are a handful. And especially a big thank you to Saha, Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Mazikeen, Ken Lando Higuchi, Chompski, Nico kaeo, Tristain Pelton, Stephen VanHuss, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, G. Weevil 3, TheRedOakShieldVirus, Hades' Nephew, Carter Barenfanger, Dr. Strawberry, Jordan Wayne Deckard, Bradney Leipe, The Government Monitoring System, Anne Charron, rumblefox, AcidSystem, Mike Bullock, Raphael Rodriguez, Dan Sweet, Mad Marstomp, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Sean Mills, Brian Arce, Cryptic Nightmares, Shadow Morningstar, Somber Puppet, Brianna Wright, Someone You Love, Said the King 56, Bad Honey, S-Man, Kiri the Sloth, Patrick Schoolmeister, Thomas Burgett, Barbara Maceo, Bobby Carmen, Liam Newman, The Homeless Bird 93, Sky Harbor, Caleb Dougal, Last Blade Song, Eliminator 86, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, and Corey X Kenshin. A big thank you to all of you guys and everybody down there in the description. I really can't thank you guys enough for supporting the show. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And everybody who listens. Sweet dreams.